All right, so let's talk about the Sabbath, and let's do from a teaching perspective, and I'm going to give some sources. So, dear sister here said the Sabbath was from the beginning of creation. God rests from creation long before it was ever written. Paul never said that. Well, first of all, Paul did actually say that. Here, Paul definitely says, therefore, don't let anyone judge you in regard to food or drink or in the matter of a festival or a new moon or a Sabbath day. These are a shadow of what was to come. The substance is Christ. So obviously, if you have the substance, whatever the shadow was does not need to be there anymore. And that's what we're going to demonstrate in this video. Let's talk about it. So I'm always saying that everything that is described in the Bible is not prescribed, okay? The Sabbath was described in Genesis, where God rested on the seventh day, but it was not prescribed then. It was not prescribed to be kept by people until Exodus. Let's look at it.
Question: when was marriage prescribed?
So I asked the question, when was marriage prescribed? And
all right,
here we see the responses as we go through. Dear Elder Betton responded, asking a question doesn't debunk a single thing I said in the video. The Sabbath was not prescribed in Genesis. There is not a single verse of scripture or anyone keeping the Sabbath before it is prescribed by God through Moses in Exodus to Israel, not the world. Adam, Noah, Enoch, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, none of them are shown in scripture keeping the Sabbath. Our rest is not found in a day of the week, it's found in a person. Thanks for showing my video. To which we had a few exchanges where I said, well, you didn't really answer the question. And his response is, because the question is deflection, you couldn't refute my point, so you resorted to a red herring. Let's pause right there. A red herring is a change of subject and to move it onto a totally different trajectory. However, in theology, see, a lot of themes are tied together, linked so much that it's very hard to separate them. Now, my reason for asking the question is to show or to test his hermeneutic. What do I mean by that? Well, he's applying a particular principle to how he understands the biblical text. So there's nothing showing that the Sabbath is prescribed in Genesis because none of the patriarchs appear to keep the Sabbath. There's no mention of them keeping the Sabbath. So he's using an argument from silence because there's no mention of them not keeping the Sabbath. But that's for a later video. So my question, when is marriage prescribed? Because in the same chapter, Genesis chapter 2, we see God joining the man and the woman who he had just separated physically. He rejoins them in marital union. Moses adds the commentary, therefore shall a man leave his mother and father and shall cleave to his wife, and the two shall be one flesh. So my question is, if you're applying the Sabbath as prescribed to Israel, when is marriage prescribed? And I could have added to whom and by whom, but the answer comes back as this. You could have asked your question without showing my video. If you wanted to ask the question and go ahead and do so. But it's pointless to show my video and not address it. You can refute the point. You can't refute the point, and it's obvious. Marriage is not a prescription. Otherwise, everyone would be commanded to get married. Interesting. What you thought was clever wasn't thought through thoroughly. Oh, dear Brother Betton, it was very well thought through. And your answer was even more shocking than I expected it to be. My expectation was that you would say, yes, it is prescribed and it was prescribed for Israel. That would be a logical answer if you are applying the same hermeneutics to that particular passage of scripture, because in Israel's system of life, we see that marriage is very much a prescription for them. One of the big things in Israelite society, especially at that point in history, was infertility. Infertility was viewed as the curse of God. But yet, infertility wasn't just to be tested by everybody going out willy-nilly and having the conjugal rights. No, God had prescribed how families were to be formed and how children were to be brought into the world and how those same children were to be brought up and taught in the fear of the Lord. So marriage is very much a prescription for Israel. Now you see, you were between a rock and a hard place, because if you said that marriage was prescribed only for Israel, then you'd have a serious problem biblically. You just chose to jump straight into the water and say that marriage is not prescribed at all. The fifth commandment: honor thy father and thy mother, that thy days may be long upon the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee. And the seventh commandment: thou shalt not commit adultery. Both of those are underpinned by the fact that God prescribed marriage from creation. Just like the Sabbath, which Genesis 8:20 verses 8 to 11 shows, in the same passage that Moses quotes from regarding the Sabbath, is the same underpinning for commandments 5 and 7. It also somewhat underpins commandment 10 when he talks about coveting thy neighbor's property, including wife, house, land, all of those things. So marriage is very much prescribed by God, and it is carried through into the New Testament as well. In Acts 15, the passage that anti-Sabbatarians love to use to say that the Sabbath is done away with, which we will show that it isn't. But the sexual immorality mentioned there is also underpinned by the fact that there is a prescribed way that sexual relations should take place. If there wasn't that prescription, that law wouldn't hold any weight for Jew or for Gentile. So, your application of Scripture and your interpretation from Genesis to Exodus seems to be on shaky ground. So, I didn't need to refute your Sabbath argument. Your poor handling of Scripture does that itself. So I'd encourage you to check again how you apply Genesis chapter 2 and see how it undergirds a lot of what comes later. And just a point of note, Genesis in context is written at the time of the Exodus period. Genesis covers 2,500 years of Earth's history. Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy covers a period of 40 years. And Genesis, the book, the authorship, not the events, obviously, but the authorship takes place in that 40-year time span. Some scholars have argued that it's not completed until maybe around the Babylonian exile, with other edits and insertions. I'm not going to get into that whole argument about source and source criticism. The point is that Jesus confirmed and affirmed the authorship of Moses, especially when he's dealing with the religious hypocrites. And he puts the authorship in Moses' hands. So we'll give it that 40-year time span. So what we see in Genesis is written in the context of a people who have got some clear marital prescriptions. I'm sure you're familiar with the passage on Onan. Onan knew what was to be done. Why? Because the whole of the Israelite economy revolved around strong family units and the preservation of family lines. And that could only be done when one man joined to one woman and procreated. Now, yes, there are going to be others who jump in and say, well, what about polygamy? What about polygamy? What is allowed and what is winked at is not the same as what is prescribed. What is prescribed comes before sin in a perfect environment and shows God's will for a perfect humanity. And all of these things, including the Sabbath, appear in that environment. Now, whether people kept the Sabbath or not in Genesis, that's a different matter. And I can show you theologically and biblically that the likelihood is that those patriarchs actually kept the Sabbath. But the silence of Genesis on the noun of the Sabbath, the institution, is not because necessarily it wasn't being kept, but it shows the relational experience of covenant individuals, because there was no covenant at that time. But we'll get into that in the next video, because you debunked yourself, you refuted yourself. Why? Because of poor handling of Scripture. And as Captain America says, we could do this all day. But till the next time, peace and blessings.